Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to everyone who's joining us here in the room in Salzburg, and welcome to everyone who's joining us at home on Zoom or in their offices. So we're just at the half past the hour, so I think we can give it a start. So welcome to the session. This is a Birds of a Feather session for a potential new RDA working group on the community-based catalogue of requirements for trustworthy technical repository service providers. And I think part of the session today will be to come up with a cool acronym for that working group title. My name is Ryan O'Connor, and I am working on the RDA Tiger project. I'm working for RDA Europe, and I'm the senior facilitator for RDA Tiger, and I'll be helping out with this group, which is sort of in its very early stages. And I'll explain a little bit more about the Tiger project very briefly in the next few minutes, and I'll just go through what we're going to be doing for the day. So yeah, please, if you could, those of us joining online and also in the room, there is a QR code on screen and a bit.ly link. That will bring you to the collaborative notes. So if you please add your name and contact details there, that would be great. Just so we have a record of who joined us on the day. Yeah, and if you are joining us remotely, there will be a chance later to ask questions. We'll be monitoring the Zoom in the room. So, but in the meantime, if you could just keep your mics on mute, that would be great. So just a brief run through of the agenda for the session today. So we're just running through the welcome introductions now at the moment. As I said, I'll give a very brief introduction to the overview of the RDA Tiger project and what support we're providing for this potential working group, and then hand over to my colleague Ingrid Tilo, who will just give a sort of background to the initiative and what work has been done so far. Then we have a series of very short lightning talks coming up. So one from Andrew Trelauer from the Australian Research Data Commons, one from Mark van der Sanden from Surf Saren in the Netherlands, and then one from one of the group co-chairs of Wim Hugo, who will be giving the perspective from dance. We'll then open up the discussion to everyone in the room and to those joining us on Zoom to discuss the draft case statement. So there's been some work done on this so far, but at this stage we'd like to get some more involvement from the community. And then finally, we'll have a few minutes towards the end wrapping up and so next steps. But before we start, we'll just have a very, very brief Menti poll. So there's a QR code on screen. I'll give people a second to maybe scan that. And there's also, if you can't access it via your mobile phone or whatever, you can go to menti.com, enter the code 27751563. I'll give people 1 second to access that, and I'll need to just change the screen. So if you just bear with me. Okay, I'll just change over now. So it is on screen. Yeah, I see some thumbs up in the corner, so people are accessing it. So you should be just seeing a blank page that says instructions or something like that. So let's give another second for people to log on. As I said, the code is 27751563. So the first question we have is, where are you joining us from? So obviously, a lot of people are here in Salzburg, but where is your sort of home institution? Where are you working from? And obviously, those of us at home, where are you joining us from? A couple of responses so far. Australia, which must be, is it very early or very late there? I can never get that. 8:30 at night. Good evening, people from Australia. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. So some responses from the Netherlands, Sweden, Edinburgh. Antarctica. Who's joining from Antarctica? Oh, okay, right. Okay, Antarctica via Salzburg. Interesting. Yeah, so as we'll kind of discuss in a bit more detail about kind of what we need in terms of requirements of the group, in terms of diversity of geographical membership. But it's good to see that we have across continents, including the lesser represented Antarctica content. Hopefully, we'll be able to contribute to the group. So we just another question. I can remember what it is. Yeah, what motivated you to join us today? So is it the potential that this group, the kind of brief description you provided on the RDA site, does the group have potential relevance to your work? Did you follow, are you new to RDA? Did you follow one of the RDA pathways? Did you just kind of stumble into the room? Are you in the wrong meeting? Please just let us know. Andrew Chiller motivated you to join today. Was that Andrew? Was that was not you? Interesting. It's good these responses are anonymized, so yeah, bear that in mind. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So some people from running a repository owner, two were running a repository, brilliant. Yeah, a lot of people running repositories. Curiosity, which is always good to see. Solutions to be more inclusive to the data ecosystem. I think that's part of one of the motivations here, definitely. About just how we can sort of be more inclusive, but how we can open up the idea of trustworthiness to be that bit more inclusive to different service providers. We have, scroll down, there's offering digital preservation as a service. That's definitely a kind of, we can group that with the some of the repository people running repositories. Natural extension of GORC. So for those of you who don't know, the GORC is the Global Open Research Commons Working Group. It's part of the RDA here. One of the groups is actually supported by the Tiger Project as well. We'll explain that in a little bit more detail in a minute. Last year's session on trust, core trust seal, that discussed this possible BoF. So yeah, so the idea for this session and this group has been kind of incubating for a while now. So yeah, hopefully people will have picked up a few more interested people along the way. Repository providers, again, yeah, providing institutional repository. Ignorance is always a good sign. Ignorance / curiosity, hopefully. That would be how we can see that. Yeah, okay. Thanks for the responses there. It's good just to get an idea of what people's perspective. I know for new people joining RDA, sometimes it can be a bit daunting. Everyone seems like an absolute bona fide expert in their area, but it's always good to see that some people are just here to learn. They're curious about different services and things that are provided. So I'll go back to my slides now, if I can manage this navigation. So I should bring up this, and if I go back to my slides, go on to the RDA Tiger project. Let's skip on a few slides. Cool. So yeah, I'll just give a very brief overview of the Tiger project now. So as I mentioned, we this potential working group is being supported by the Tiger project. For those of you who don't know, so working groups traditionally in RDA would have been very much self-starting. They would have had to obviously come up with a concept or the procedure to address whatever issues the working group is dealing with, but then also have to deal with some of the more sort of administrative and practical sides of setting up a working group, like making the connections with the right communities, simple things like setting up meeting times, that type of thing. But with the RDA Tiger project, where it's sort of hopefully taking some of that administrative burden from working group co-chairs, as it's explained here, lowering the barrier to start working group activity, helping to guide people through the case statement procedure, putting together making connections with different relevant institutions. We're doing that with a number of different groups. One of those groups, one of the pilot groups for this project is this TRSP's group. So we'll hopefully that this group will benefit from the support we're providing. The project itself is running until from the start of this year, from the start of 2023 to the end of 2025. We have a kind of rolling open calls evaluation process. So if you're involved in any other working groups, or if you have an idea for a working group, or you just want to find out a little bit more, please don't hesitate to come ask me or anyone with one of these cool Tiger lanyards. And we also have a kind of booth over just in the main area here. So please, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to come and ask. Just a brief overview of some of the services we're providing. So I lead the facilitation service here in the green circle. Again, that's very much about just helping the groups get started, making sure they're doing all the right things, they're following their various RDA criteria. We also have a communication service, which helps to make sure that the group is connecting with the right people, and also helping to communicate any deliverables or outputs that the group might produce through its lifespan. We have a landscape and engagement, again, which is about making sure the group is just getting a sense of where the group sits within the landscape, and making those connections with the right initiatives. And towards the end of the group's life cycle, we have an output service, which helps around the production of the group's final recommendation and making sure that is in a fit state for people to use, and also getting an idea of where it sits in this maintenance facility, which is in process with that's being developed by the project. Yeah, as I said, we please get in touch. Please feel free to come ask us or get in touch with the via any of the links here, the addresses, or just have a read on the website. I'll put all these links in the collaborative notes. I'll populate that in the next few minutes. So yeah, all these links from the slides will be available for you to access there. So next, I'll hand over to my colleague Ingrid Dilo, who will just give a background on the on this initiative and how it's going to fit in with the previous work done in RDA on the Core Trust Seal and Trustworthy certification. So over to you, Ingrid.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ingrid Dilo. I work at DANS, which is a repository in the Netherlands, and I'm also quite involved in Core Trust Seal. And I want to talk a little bit to why it is that we are together in this room today, talking about this possibility of creating a catalogue of requirements for trustworthy, no, not trustworthy, technical, I still have to get used to the acronym, technical repository service providers. And for that context, I think it is useful to start at the beginning of Core Trust Seal. So for those of you who do not know, Core Trust Seal is a certification mechanism for data repositories. And Core Trust Seal was born under the umbrella of the Research Data Alliance. And for those of you who were in the session yesterday on the adoption and outputs, the plenary one, also heard about Core Trust Seal as one of the, well, you could say successors, I think, of the RDA. So before Core Trust Seal, we had two different certification standards for repositories available. One was called the Data Seal of Approval, that had its origins in my institution in DANS, but at the time already was run by an international board and had a strong focus or its origins in the social sciences. On the other hand, there was also the World Data System that had its own core certification procedure and requirements, and they were very much alike. And I remember vividly in 2013 sitting on the floor in the corridors during the first plenary in Gothenburg, talking to Françoise Genova, me coming from DSA, she coming from WDS, and discovering, hey, this looks very much alike. Why don't we start a conversation to see if we can bring these things together and go from two standards to one? So that is all history that happened. We set up a working group in RDA, and at some point in time, I think it was 2017, we had the Core Trust Seal requirements that are really community-based. And we had a procedure for certification. So that became Core Trust Seal. It became its own organization. And as you will see, it has been quite successful. Here you see the number of certifications over the last 6 years. And it's important, I think, to stress that Core Trust Seal is a not-for-profit initiative, community-based, peer review processes are at the basis, born within RDA, still strong ties with RDA. It's global and it is domain agnostic. And it's also important to say that it is mainly focused on organizations that provide active curation for their data for long-term preservation, which means that you see that we in the requirements ask for long-term preservation plans, and we ask for a good knowledge of the community, the designated community that the repository serves. Now, it is possible already within Core Trust Seal to outsource certain activities, but it is also still important that those repositories that outsource certain elements remain entitled and to decide over why and when and how preservation actions take place. And they also need to have the ownership, the responsibilities there. And that is very important because one of the requirements to be a trustworthy digital repository is, of course, that you make sure that the objects that you hold remain accessible and usable and interpretable for your community of users. Now, what we have seen over the years is that I showed you the numbers going up, but we have also seen that repositories become more and more federated structures. So you see that organizations are using all kinds of services and products from external providers. What we saw that happening within Core Trust Seal as well, we got a huge number of applications, and we also see more and more that we get applications for organizations that do not necessarily fall directly into scope of that standards. So what we see happening is we see more generic repositories coming in, but we also see organizations coming in that can never comply with all of the requirements because they only deal with certain aspects that we take into account in Core Trust Seal. So in 2020, we, as Core Trust Seal, had a consultation of the community because of that increase in outsourcing. And it is clear that repositories are using more and more software providers and providers of technical infrastructure that are external. Sometimes there are MOUs or SLAs available as a basis for that, but sometimes they really use software and other products without any specific relationship. And then, of course, you run into the issue that what a repository would like when they use external services, that they still are able to get a certification. So that means that those service providers ideally need to be compliant with the requirements that relate to the activities and the services that they provide. So that picture came out of our experience within Core Trust Seal and also out of the community consultation. So in terms of the current needs, it was clear that there is not necessarily directly, there wasn't necessarily directly a lot of support to create a separate formal certification. That is also quite a huge job, we know from experience, but there is need on more clarity on how those external partners can provide services to repositories and make sure that these repositories can still certify to prove their trustworthiness. So from that came the idea that maybe through community consensus within the RDA, we can work on a standard set of functions and actions that cover those services. And also attach to that guidance for those external service providers, and also define what kind of evidence would be needed to make sure that this is happening. So a possible result could be that we try to assess a couple of third parties to see and see whether we can get to some kind of Core Trust Seal compliancy models based on a set of functions with descriptions, with evidence, etc., etc. So this is a little bit of the background of why we are sitting here. And personally, I thought that the possibility of having support for a group like this through the RDA Tiger project would provide an excellent opportunity to push this forward. There is a community need. Core Trust Seal is very much a volunteer community-based organization. This is an opportunity to get support to move this forward and maybe get to a result that we can all benefit from within 1.5 years. So that is what I wanted to say about this. We will now have 3 presentations of people who also think that this might be a useful exercise from their own organizational perspective. And I'm looking at the chair, who is Andrew starts, right? Good. Then I'll leave it to you. And questions that we have discussion at the end.
So, So my name's Andrew Treloar. I work for the Australian Research Data Commons. I should also say in this context that I am one of the co-chairs of the Global Open Research Commons. It's already been referenced. I am, I think I'm still an honorary visiting fellow at Dunce, so I'm kind of Dutch. And I'm also the program committee chair for the IDW 2025, which will be in Brisbane. So come to Brisbane in 2025. So my organization is a national provider of a range of research infrastructure services. They were originally designed as generic services. We're currently focusing our efforts around bringing sets of services together to meet thematic needs: people for health and medical, planet for ecology, earth science, humanities, arts, social sciences, and indigenous, which is what that last acronym is for. Those links will take you to more information about each of those if you want. We're different to some of the organizations that you'll hear about this morning because we don't provide storage. Well, we provide storage for data that's actively being analyzed on our cloud compute, but we don't provide long-term archival storage. So the definitive data that people point to, we assume that it's being stored somewhere, but we don't do it ourselves. We have invested in a Core Trust Seal project in the past. I led the program that did that, and we do support a national community practice around trusted data repositories. Some of you may have seen this diagram already. This is just to give you a sense of the problem domain. So the notional line down the bottom shows how the amount of data we hope changes with lifecycle status. One of my colleagues who helped build this describes this diagram as dream or delusion, by which Frankie Stevens, for those of you who know her, by which she means that, yes, it'd be lovely if this happened. In particular, it'd be lovely if, let's try, no, I'm not going to try and, yeah, okay, I was going to try and use a laser pointer. It'd be nice if the data volume actually dropped off like that. However, I suspect that in practice, what happens is the throwing out of data doesn't happen as vigorously as it should. But in any case, my organization operates up to kind of analyze and collaborate. And from that point to the right, we don't really do anything yet. From a national perspective, most data in Australia is held by this mix of systems. I'm not suggesting this is unique to Australia, but it's certainly something that we're very aware of. And there's a lot of it out there. So there's been some work done to try and analyze how much research data is held by Australian institutions. 300 petabytes, growing at about 25% per year. We do have a small number of Core Trust Seal certified repositories. Mostly these are specialist. Geoscience Australia, the Australian Antarctic Data Centre, the Australian Ocean Data Network, the Australian Data Archive, which is social science, Paradisec, which is linguistic and cultural data. And we have one generalist CTS repository run by the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. But that's a very small proportion. Most of the data is held by universities in their repositories, and they are not CTS certified. From a national strategic perspective, we have a road mapping process that we go through every 4 to 5 years. This identified storage as an issue, but didn't really focus on trusted storage. Now, the government's currently going through a process of coming up with a national digital research infrastructure strategy. This is going to inform the next 4 years of investment. And the current draft of that talks a lot about metadata, really doesn't talk about storage. And so my organization is trying to provide input, well, it's not trying, is providing input into that process that, yes, there are actually 3 kinds of challenge. You have to decide what you're going to store. You have to solve how you're going to describe it, and you have to solve where it's going to get stored. And at the moment, the emphasis is on how it's described and not the other 2. And it's also not clear how this is going to translate into investment, although there will be investment next year. So some closing thoughts. Trust is clearly important for the integrity of the scholarly research ecosystem. And indeed, if you are having making policy decisions that depend on research outputs, you need to be able to trust the research outputs. But at the moment, our National Research Infrastructure Roadmap only talks about trust in the context of trust and identity. So it's, do we believe that this person is who they say they are, not do we believe that this data has not been changed. In storage terms, we're a long way behind the European Union. In terms of CTS, and here I speak from a position of profound ignorance, but I would say that I think the ability to support CTS requirements needs to be granular rather than binary, and the interaction between a provider that says, well, we can do a 3 out of 5 job for a particular criterion, and how that translates into whether someone using those services gets CTS certification. Is it going to be an interesting one? What level do you have to get to before you can say that's sufficient? And of course, from my country's perspective, before you can talk about trusted storage, you still have to solve the storage problem. Thank you.
From Surf Sarah.
Yes, I'm Mark van Zanne. I'm from Surf. I'm enterprise architect, but I have been involved in developing the Surf data repository for long term. And this is not a success story. So we went through the process of getting the core trust seal, but it was denied. And I think I want to describe a little bit the background reasons why we did not then get the core trust seal and why this is really needed. Surf is an Surf is a national organization supporting research and education in the Netherlands. And we do this by providing many different kinds of services supporting the education and research communities within the Netherlands. Surf is also in cooperation. So all the research universities, the University of Biosciences, UNIC colleges are all members of Surf. It is really a cooperation. And this is also why we try to provide the best services for our communities. And why I'm describing why we do this as Surf, as a national organization, is I think there's also a difference between what is a service of what is an organization, and how far is a provider, a trustworthy organization, providing those kinds of services. We provide a whole set of different kinds of services supporting the research within the Netherlands. This picture is about data services, and we try to provide different kinds of services so that we can support the research through the whole data life cycle. And the data repository service is just part of the whole stack of all the services which we provide within the Netherlands. This is just a picture of our data repository service. So it is being offered. Users can make use of this. We can make contracts on basis of making use of the service. But we want to show that we are a trustworthy provider, that this is a trustworthy service. Therefore, you also went through the process of the core trust seal. What is the focus of our data repository service? We are a service provider with many different kinds of services, but also, for example, HPC computing services. And what we also saw that there are a large number of researchers, not the huge number of researchers in the Netherlands, but a very specific target group of researchers which generates a lot of data. And the scale of the amount of data they produce, which they want to make available, many of the repositories at our institutional levels are not able to cope with those kinds of volumes. Therefore, we have started up the development of this data repository to really serve those type of users which do not find any place where they can make the data available. So it's really about the large-scale data sets making available. Therefore, also because it is really about providing large-scale repository for large scale, we also provide the support to those kinds of researchers who want to make use of when they want to make use of their data sets available through the service. Because it's not easy if you want to, for example, publish a data set of 100 terabytes or even 2 petabytes. You have to go through the process. How do you want to organize your data? How do you want to describe the data? What are different data sets within your organization of your data? And this is what the level of support we also provide towards the users. For example, one case of a data set was generated, was a data set about 70 terabytes, and they had written the data in an own data format. So we collaborated with the researchers to change the format of the data to HDF5 before the publication. We even needed our HPC supercomputing to do the whole conversion of one data set to another data set. So we did provide all the kind of support at the level of, at the time, also at the ingest of the data set. But we went also for the procedure for the core trust seal. We did this in 2018. We filled in all the requirements. We also defined what our scope of our repository is, us as organization. The big challenge, because we are a generic service provider, was, okay, how do you describe what is your designated user community? We serve all researchers in the Netherlands, so it is not a specific domain repository. So maybe it is how we did reward the designated community within our application. But it was as feedback from the reviewers that, oh, there is no specific designated community. This is a red flag. So, but okay, I can understand this, but how can we then improve that we can identify what would be then our designated community from us as a generic service provider? If this is not the case and we cannot apply for the core trust seal, okay, but how can we then show that we are still a trustworthy organization, a trustworthy service? And I think therefore this working group is needed to make it more defined. How can an organization show that it is a trustworthy organization providing those kind of services? That was the last one.
Thank you, Mark. So next up is Wim Hugo. So we'll have a space after Wim's brief presentation to take any questions you might have had for the three lightning talk presentations, and also I'll keep an eye on the Zoom chat in case there's any questions. Over to you, Wim.
Thanks. Maybe a somewhat different perspective, because Dance, of course, is also part of the national infrastructure in the Netherlands, and increasingly integrated nationally and in Europe, and to some extent globally. And we have been certified as a trustworthy repository for a considerable time, first via data seal of approval and then core trust seal. But personally, I am very keen to broaden and refine the umbrella of trust to include things such as a wider range of research outputs, which is shown in gray here, because I don't think that's the focus of this birds of a feather session, but it's nevertheless required. A wider range of actors in the landscape that covers things like curation, standalone storage, computing, preservation, and processing services, which addresses, I think, the question raised by Mark. And then I think very important to make trust scalable, because there are about 150 trustworthy certified repositories in the world. RE3 data lists about 3,000. And I think there's still more of the iceberg under the water, because RE3 data probably represents 1/10 of the repositories worldwide. So there's a tiny fraction of repositories worldwide that are certified at the moment. And we need to find a way to make the certification of trust more scalable. And I think there's another aspect there, apart from making it machine actionable. We also would probably need some kind of machine or automated contracting in that whole process of integrating these trustworthy services into our processes. Now, 100 years ago, science was easy, because you would meet someone and grow to know them. And then if you needed their data, you would just ask for it, and they would get a student or an assistant to copy it from one piece of paper to another and send it by mail. So the relationship was quite direct. That changed when people started using what's essentially post offices or post boxes to say, I'm going to put my stuff somewhere in a repository. And then because I trust the repository and you also trust the repository, I'll direct you to where I've put this stuff. But the trust relationship was very personal. I mean, each person trusted that mailbox in a different way. So this third scenario basically is the one that we're looking at now, where there's some kind of verification of that trust, so that third parties can rely on that verification to inform them when they want to use these services. And there's basically three areas there that we need to focus on. that then leads to the next slide that I want to share. So for me, these elements of broadened trust that I think we need to focus on potentially in working group or interest group coming from this session is authentication, because if you want to have trust between two contracting parties, you need to know that you're talking to the person you think you are talking to, or to the service that you think you are talking to. And then there's compliance at different levels of maturity, as Andrew also suggested, and they range across a whole bunch of things for me. That includes trust, but is not limited to it. And there's overlaps between these sort of community expectations and mandatory elements of compliance certification, such as GDPR, policy-related things, rules of participation. So we need to frame, in my view, the verification of trust within a larger framework that can be expanded to include these other kinds of verification that's also needed in an ecosystem. And then, as I said, finally, the idea that we need some kind of contract, and that contracting needs to be automated to the point where it can almost support microservices. Because just a simple example, for instance, if you would have something like a type conversion service to say, I'm going to send you a CSV file and I want you to convert it to HDF5 or something like that, but it contains sensitive data, you need a way to contract that microservice if the user requests its use without having to go to your legal department and enter into some written agreement that will first be signed by everybody before the service can be used. So this, for me, is actually quite a significant challenge in the whole chain of trust if we want to make it truly scalable and automatable. Okay, so I think that's it from me. There's lots of time for discussion later on, and we'll take it up there.
Thank you, Wim. Before we move on to maybe discussing the case statement in a bit of detail, so there's a link on screen for the draft case statement. Is there any? I don't see any questions in the Zoom chat. But are there any questions in the room from anyone on what has been presented so far? I think there might be a roving mic if people do have any questions or comments or anything to clarify. Kevin, you have your hand up. Is there a roving mic? Oh, I think you have to. Yeah. Is it not? Yeah, I think the stable mic. Sorry.
I'm not sure whether this is more appropriate to discussing the case statement, but I had the feeling, so there were three interesting presentations, each of which seemed to articulate a problem that's interesting. I'm not sure I really felt a strong connection between them. So certainly, Wim, I mean, your discussion around, certifying in a sense individual services that repositories may need to use. I certainly understand the case for that. I think, Andrew, from your perspective, that issue of the very generalist role that ARDC needs to provide, and from Surf's perspective, it's more beyond this feeling that you're trying to provide something very generalist, and that particular experience you had with Core Trust Seal, which seemed to me, I don't see fundamentally why you couldn't have got Core Trust Seal certification. And I'm not sure if they don't, as of yet, there's not a coherent whole here. There are three interesting problems. I'm hoping perhaps when we get to the case statement, you will make the case that this is really one problem. Is that fair?
Anyone like to, the speakers like to respond to that, or? Yeah, sorry, but it'd be a case of having to pass the mic around.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. So at least my perspective on this is that if one can get to the point where the individual service components of our infrastructure can be certified individually, it's then a question of convincing a certification authority, such as Core Trust Seal, that it's possible for an infrastructure or a service provider to certify only parts of the sets of requirements that they currently have. And that is good enough for the community to understand that If they don't, for argument's sake, offer discipline-specific curation, that's okay, because all the other parts of what they are offering is certified. And I think that will go a long way towards sorting out the sort of binary situation that we have now, where you either are certified completely or not at all. And that's not functional or useful.
And so Andrew Trelaw, if I could add to that. So the three talks that you saw were constructed independently. If I can now try and retrospectively engineer some coherence across the three, from my perspective, I'm coming from a setting where most of the repositories that are likely to be part of whatever Australia puts in place are going to be generalist repositories. So the issue of, do you need to define your community down to a particular subset in order to get a degree of certification is, well, anyway, it was an issue for this one. So the question of how you provide certification for generalist repositories is something that will be live for us. And the other issue, I guess, is that, and I suspect this is true in Europe as well, that we're seeing an increasing diversity of service providers. No one mentioned commercial service providers yet, but there are, you know, we know that Amazon and Azure at least are interested in aspects of this space. And so I think the way that I would tie the three talks together is that we need a much more, no, let me make a statement before I say what I'm going to say. I think Core Trust Seal is great, and it's been a wonderful development, and it's now time to nuance it or start nuancing it. And so I think the challenge, I'm not sure whether Ingrid necessarily wants to hear this. The challenge I see coming out of this session is twofold. Firstly, it's how do you define the requirements for providers of subsets of services, as Wim's just mentioned, and then what are the possible implications of that for what Core Trust Seal certification means, in air quotes. And those are clearly related, but for me at least separate problems.
For us, it was also not really clear why we did not get the Core Trust Seal. We had also interactions with the reviewers to see, okay, did we have the wrong wording in a...
Apologies, one moment, there's just changed the battery in the microphone, I think. I know there were I saw a few people with their hands up in the room, so we'll keep the microphone moving around the room once it's recharged.
Okay, thank you. Going back, yeah, for us, it was also not clear why we did not got the Core Trust Seal. Maybe that's just with the wording. Maybe defining a no designated community was more, or define it as a multidisciplinary community, because we serve multiple communities. So therefore, I think for us, that was not clear. But there are also other kinds of services. We have been, for example, talking about PD services. Has also a long-term perspective. How can you say which PD service is trustworthy? And that is beyond the scope as what the Core Trust Seal is. But I would say that also for this level kind of services, you would have something so that you can show that you are showing your trustworthiness as an organization, but also as a service.
So I have two comments or questions. One is, if this is a subset of services approach, which I think makes a lot of sense, how do we tie them together, and how do they relate as a chain that needs to be tied together to process like core trust seal? So I have the worry that we kind of wash out the trust principles and the idea of trust by calling this trustworthy as well. Don't we more need things like, or mean things like reliable or sustainable or something like that? I think we should not confuse this with trustworthy preservation, trustworthy repositories themselves, which have a lot of institutional aspect to it. And the other thing is, speaking about services from a user perspective, personally, I always find that core trust seal in particular is far too high level to capture anything that adequately describes the technical infrastructure to me. And that holds true not only for core trust seal, but also for Nestor seal. And the best one out of the certification standards would be ISO 16363. But even that doesn't give me all the info I want to know to be able to trust the service. So I really get the point about designated community. I think, you know, that's a discussion in itself. A lot of other national archives share the same problem there, but I think what we need is not something to make service providers be able to fulfill something like core trust seal, but we need something that goes far beyond that and enables the community to understand service providers much better and how those service providers relate to their own processes.
So coming from the health data space, we did a review of COVID-19 related repositories and platforms for COVID-19 data reuse. And of the like almost 400 repositories or platforms, one of them had adopted or had a core trust seal. And that's Import, which anybody in biomedical space would know because they've been around for quite some time. So I think what's important, and I really like this idea of like putting certifications on different services because the binary is absolutely not working. Because if you have 1 out of 400, you know, the approach is not working. So I think as we're looking towards like a new approach or evolving the approach, it's really important to understand what is working. And when I've talked to folks and I've said, you know, why didn't you go after core trust seal? They have different reasons. And so I think understanding what those reasons are and why they're not pursuing something like core trust seal because it's just too burdensome or whatever the reason, we need to provide more information for folks who want to reuse their data to help them choose between just this exploding number of repositories. So I think like part of the working group, it would be interesting to think about, you know, what is working and to do some kind of more qualitative work to understand why it hasn't worked in certain spaces.
Any more comments from anyone in the room? Wim, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I think one of the other challenges that one faces if you go down to assessing, let's say, quality or reliability or sustainability of individual services, in Fair Impact and Fair Core for EASK, we are working on assessment of compliance of PID services and stacks with the EASK PID policy. And just for that one aspect, you know, there are probably 200 things that need to be tested and verified to say, okay, I'm compliant with the EASK PID policy. So on the one hand, one needs to move towards this more granular approach, and I don't think we have a choice because otherwise we are not serving the community. But it is also not trivial to do so. You know, to moving that one level deeper than core trust seal, going to take a lot of effort.
Yeah, I have a bit of a question about the scope. I remember in the last plenary, this came up during the session on trust. And one of the things that was mentioned was that a lot of people who use the same software as their base for their repository are basically filling in the same answers for a lot of the core trust seal requirements. Is that going to be part of this? For example, that you sort of certify particular software choices that they're compliant with specific requirements of the core trust seal, and therefore because you use that software you don't have to fill that information in? Because I know, for example, we are working on the application right now, and a lot of the information that we supply is just on how Dataverse works, while in reality it feels a bit odd that I'm describing how Dataverse works instead of Dataverse doing that. So I was wondering if it's within the scope of this as well.
You want to?
I understand this comment, but for me, it is really, I see a difference between a software and a provider. And how a service is being provided on basis of the same technology can be completely different. So therefore, you need to take also this into account, not just the basic function of, okay, how software is working. Yes, because that is part of the software and you cannot change that much. But how the organization is working is different. And I think that is what we also need to capture.
Yeah, I agree, Mark, because I think you can abuse software. You could fail on version management or some of the curation aspects or whatever needs to be certified. So it's down to the user or the provider that is using that infrastructure. But on the other hand, if you have a provider of a service, and long-term preservation is a good example, in my view, to say that there is a third-party long-term preservation service that meets some of the requirements of Core Trust Seal, for example. You shouldn't have to go and recertify yourself for those criteria dealing with long-term preservation if you are using a service that's already certified. You should be able to just point to them. And this serves everybody because it's parsimonious. The evaluators of applications don't have to bother to go and check again whether all of these criteria are being met.
I'll just read that there's a comment in the Zoom chat. I'll just read that from Alex de Sherbinen, saying, in general, I like the idea of a more gradated approach to certification, taking into account the different remits of repositories. Perhaps there could be some criteria, for example, those ensuring data integrity, for which there is a hard criteria, and others that could be on the scale. It clarifies by hard criteria, it means the binary pass-fail. And a question from Alex as well. On technical repository service providers, how do you determine the trustworthiness, the size or breadth of the trustworthiness of something the size or breadth of AWS, so Amazon Web Services? I don't know, is that any of the speakers like to respond?
I think there will be challenges on this. Certainly, if you look at AWS or Microsoft or something else, it depends on what kind of agreements they have. They certainly, for me, they will not go through those kind of certification procedures, so that those organizations will get certified. And I think that is probably also the biggest problem, because they are very commercial service providers, and they provide a service as long as you pay. And that is different. And I think also there's also a different aim from us as more as public organization, because we have a different interest. It's not only earning money, but for us supporting research. Of course, it will cost, we know this, but the aim is different. Therefore, I think if your service is running on AWS or Microsoft, doesn't matter, but it depends on, okay, how can you sustain your service making use of those commercial service providers? And I think that it should be explained.
Yeah, I mean, add another point. I think that this does come back to, to the sort of points also that Wim was making about abusing software. I mean, AWS, I think, is perhaps the extreme example of it's the wrong target for certification. AWS is really something on the order of 10,000 different services, depending which options you choose. It's almost impossibly complex to understand. I'm not even sure its own providers understand it. So yeah, that is much more about, it's not AWS you would certify. If you were you might certify some particular selection of services that are provided there. Otherwise, it makes no more sense than certifying, I don't know, Seagate disks. It's not, you're not going to certify a disk manufacturer, but you might certify how particular disks are used by a particular service provider in order to do something.
And I think there is also a difference of responsibility. AWS or Microsoft will not take the responsibility of making that your service will run. They provide the resources. They take responsibility that the resources are operating and run for high percentage. But for taking the responsibility of your service, they will not take. That is your own responsibility.
Any more comments or questions from anyone in the room before I'll hand over to Wim in a minute to discuss maybe a bit more detail the case statement. I'll just double check the Zoom chat. So nothing so far. I see a hand. Yeah, I see a hand. Yeah. I came in a bit later, so I hope I'm not asking a question that was already asked, but I see that the charter only discusses data and not metadata, where there's currently a trend towards repositories hosting only the metadata and not the data, because the providers are not willing to share the data, whereas they are willing to share the metadata. Is this also part of this discussion?
I would say yes, because we already have been talking that you have different kinds of services, many different kinds of services, and how do you want to certify or show trustworthiness of those different kinds of services? So it is not only data; there's a wide range of different kinds of capabilities provided in the whole stack of services.
I would also agree, but it immediately excludes, for instance, some of the criteria currently in Core Trust Seal, because if you don't control the source of the data, you're not able to guarantee its long-term availability and preservation and so on. So I think there are going to be increasingly more aggregation platforms and things like research graph services and so on that rely on aggregated metadata. So we need to find a way to somehow include them. But as I say, the parts dealing with how the data is managed clearly then is out of scope for them.
Any further comments or questions before we move on to have a look at a bit more detail? Oh, sorry, Mike. Sorry.
Mike Pretty from Dance as well. As part of the Fair Impact project, I actually got asked whether it was possible to have some Core Trust Seal certification for a semantic artifact catalogs. And that's clearly not possible. But there is clearly also a need and a demand for that. And there will be also a need and a demand for software repositories as well. How far will this support those kind of services, and how much will this just be something that looks at the back end parts of Core Trust Seal, providing information for those who are applying for certification but need to make sure that their downstream service providers can actually provide that information for them?
Yeah, I think it's a clear need. No arguments there. But I think that in the scope of a working group in RDA, it would not be possible to include it in an 18-month work program. So how one addresses that need is probably a different question, because maybe it's a parallel or a sister working group that has an exchange with one looking at data repositories and the services around it. But I don't think it's possible to make that scope so large in the scope of, within a working group's remit.
I was just thinking of that in terms of making sure the case statement does limit that down, because some of the things that you mentioned did open it up a lot. So if we try and make sure that that is a little bit more limited, and I agree that it probably is either a second working group after this working group, or a parallel one?
So one thing I didn't mention about the health repository space is many of the repositories had never heard of Core Trust Seal, and so one thing that I had reached out to Core Trust Seal about doing is saying, okay, let's get together a community, like for me that's biomedical related repositories, and figure out who should be told about Core Trust Seal, tell them, and then think about why aren't they using Core Trust Seal. So rather than just coming up with the recommendations, to do some kind of lower work to figure out before we make the recommendations what's going to work for these specific communities, or what are the other needs, like the need for the metadata or the artifacts. So I think that would be, I mean, it's a little bit out of scope for RDA, but I think if there are folks who are interested, I think it would be interesting to think about what could we do to really increase the uptake. What are the changes that would actually help in terms of getting people to use this, because we need it, and we need something that's going to work.
Thank you. I'm Mari Klemla from the Finnish Social Science Data Archive. I'm also a current Core Trust Seal board member. I think there are many things here that I could comment, but I will focus on one thing. So I think what's very important that comes out of these questions and comments as well is transparency. So whatever we are going to do, it needs to be transparent, but also the repositories need to be more transparent in their practices. And and there's and when it comes to repositories, I think there's also, we already know quite a lot about the repositories based on the projects like, I have worked in the SOC project and the EOS Nordic project with several repositories. So we do know, and we know that there's a gap for these technical service providers, but there are other gaps. So this, and we need to start somewhere. So I'm also wondering how wide the scope can really be. As we mentioned, this is a 1.5 year working group. So that's something to discuss, but a really good discussion and great comments.
Christian Oman from Ecrin. I have a question. If a service is relying on other services, and you want to approach it by certifying the sub-services, then the question for the construction of the whole system is it enough where if qualified documents are presented from the sub-services, or has it to be checked or validated that the sub-service is really functioning as it is intended in the full system? So what can be delegated and what has to be done? I think this is very important to check.
Yeah, so I think two comments. The one in response to Mari, I think one of the things we can consider is to focus on the sort of pathway that Core Trust Seal has mapped out to say that technical service providers must also be certified, because that's step one in broadening the umbrella of trust. And of course, one doesn't have to stop there, but it at least makes some progress towards a goal. So that's one possibility. And then in terms of the assessment mechanism, if one can put it that way, for the EOS PID policy, the first level of assessment that we're looking at is to say that this is a self-assessment with public evidence, and nobody's going to audit it or review it. We rely on people to be honest about it, and anybody can go and check whether the evidence that they have provided is indeed satisfactory. Then Core Trust Seal is sort of up to the next step, where it's still mostly a question of providing public evidence, but it's reviewed by audit, in essence, Core Trust Seal's reviewer corpus. And then the third level is sort of tests that you've got to pass, and that becomes very, very complex and difficult. So I think initially for any new criteria, it could maybe be a self-assessment with public evidence to keep it simple, and then move to a next step of potentially some kind of audited certification.
Any more comments or questions from the audience? I know we have a time just in the agenda. I know we've kind of set aside time to look at the case statement, but obviously this discussion sort of spills over into what we're going to include in the case statement. We are capturing a lot of this on a colleague from Dance, Simon Soldner, is currently working busily capturing the notes, and we also have the session recorded as well. So this will all feed into the shape of the case statement. Wim or Ingrid, I don't know if you want to focus a little bit more detail on the case statement, or will I hand over to you?
Yeah, of course.
The light. Well, maybe just to say that we within the context of the RDA Tiger project, where there is resource available, took a kind of a proactive approach, in the sense that we just happily started off trying to write already a draft case statement, which is by no means set in stone, but just to give us a flying start. And it is wonderful to see that there is so much active engagement in this group. So it is really also a call out to everybody to join this group and to think along, because I think one of the main aspects that came, at least for me, out of this discussion is that we have 100,000 wishes, and there is lots of things that we want to improve. But I would very much like to emphasize that it would be great if we can narrow down the scope, that we can get community consensus of what first step we are going to take in this group in order to reach a concrete result in 18 months, rather than, having half a year of discussions of going all over the place. So I think that is probably the first thing that we need to do. And for that, of course, we need your active engagement. We also need co-chairs for this group. Luckily, we already found one, and you have already heard him, which is Wim. But anybody who is interested in joining in that capacity is very welcome. So yeah, I'm not sure whether anybody has already taken a look at that case statement. It's been open for a while. We left comments on purpose open in it as well. So for everybody to see what the thoughts are. So I don't know, Wim, shall we go through it according to the different topics, headers? Yeah, I think so. Although I don't think that we will come to a solution here, but maybe we can progress the discussion already a little bit. And I see Kevin's hand.
And apologies, if you intend to cover this as you go through it, just tell me to stop. So I've only had a look at the case statement just before this meeting and during the meeting. And I must admit, I did what I do with any group statement. I start with, okay, what is the end result going to be? That's, what's the output? And then working backwards, and how are you going to get there? It took me a while really to understand what the output is. It's going to be some recommendations. What's not clear to me is who are they for? Because I think there's a mistake perhaps we made with a number of other RDA groups, that one, you get together a lot of very well-informed, clever people. We produce some recommendations on here is how the world could be made better, but it's not very clear who then has to take action as a result of that. And do you have a clear, is this in a sense aimed at the Core Trust Seal board, telling them you need to change something? Is it aimed at another group saying you need to set something up?
I've just been passed the ball with a whole bunch of tacklers coming down on me. So yeah, I think the Core Trust Seal is certainly a target for the recommendations, but I think we must also be reasonable and say that it is not necessarily only aimed at Core Trust Seal, because Core Trust Seal provides a service based on recommendations generated in RDA some years ago. But one should potentially not make the work in the RDA working group synonymous with things that Core Seal has got to do. So Core Seal would be a consumer of the recommendations. Potentially one also has to engage the other certification options that are there, Nestor and ISO. Yeah, so that becomes more complex again.
I think the same. The time for the catalogue of requirements that was produced from WDS and DSA. I mean, it's open to everybody to pick it up and do something with it. It's openly available. I see doubt in Kevin's eyes.
Yeah.
So absolutely, yeah, there are some things where simply saying this is open to everybody to use is perhaps the right thing to do. And there are lots of outputs that RDA produces where one could be happy that that's the end result. But here you really do want action. You want to end up with somebody doing some certifying. So perhaps one of the things working on the case statement to do is, if we can't at the beginning say who that's going to be, then make it one of the goals of the group over 18 months to identify some other actors. I mean, you've mentioned some, CTS, the other certifying bodies, and make sure that they get engaged with this over the process of that 18 months. I think that'd be, because it would be a great shame to produce recommendations and not have anybody do something at the end of it.
Thank you. I'm a bit puzzled. So how are your recommendations different to kind of metrics that you want to apply to the capabilities of repositories? It seems to me that what we really need is a system like the FAIR metrics, for example, that we can apply to repositories in order to evaluate them, which of course always is a critical thing because many people are hesitant to being evaluated, many repositories as well. How, in your view, is that different to the catalogue of recommendations or catalogue of whatever you want to collect on the repositories?
So it seems to me that the difference is that this proposal, and I have nothing to do with this proposal, let me be clear, but this proposal is transitioning from a world in which you have a unitary service provider, which is a repository which does everything, to a much more complex environment where you have multiple providers of different kinds of services that aggregate up together into something that people can use. And so I think the idea of a matrix that you could apply to a certification matrix that you could apply to a single repository, yes, I can see how that could work. The more nuanced and complex question of how you assess individual service providers who are providing particular components of something that ends up being a service is quite a different kind of challenge.
Kevin, maybe just a quick response before I hand to you. So the structuring that we've identified in FAIR Core for EASC for these kinds of assessments and evaluations is that these catalogs of requirements are like criteria that express what one expects from a given service or object or whatever. But that's then tied to metrics and tests. The tests must tell you what the value of the metric is and so on and so on. And at the moment, those metrics and tests are up to the evaluator, in this case, Core Seal, to determine what their metrics and tests look like. But it is conceivable, if one could include it in the time available, that one could also develop recommendations, not only about the metrics and the tests, but also the benchmarks, levels of maturity, for instance. Say, if you score X in this test, then we think that you are at a high level of maturity, for argument's sake. So there's a sort of a framework that we can explore for this. But again, getting down to that level of detail in the 18 months that's available is probably not feasible.
Yeah, and I think just again to respond to that point, I mean, one clear thing I can see that's different in that we already have mechanisms to certify individual repositories in the way that Andrew said, but where you can see the decisions about selection, the services, everything are being provided by a single entity. But to declare my interest in this, so 25 years ago, I was running a group that was providing digital preservation services to other organizations. And I was also involved in the development of some of those early standards like TRAC that have led to some of the things we got today. And I was conscious then that the group that I set up, they're still going. I'm not there anymore, and they do still provide preservation and repository services for others. We could get certification for an instance of what we were doing. So we provided preservation for the UK National Archives for 15 years. They now have taken it in-house. They finally got the expertise to do that themselves, but they originally contracted it out because they're aware that they had no idea how to do this, but they had a problem that needed solving. So I could get certification using whatever standards around at the time for the service, the archive we ran for the UK National Archives. But none of those standards would allow me to certify the service my group provided. And if you want to go to a new customer and say, look, we have this badge, all I could say is, we have this badge for some things we did for those people, and we have this badge for some things we did for these people. And I think that even just looking at that, so the people like, now you've got players like Figshare and a bunch of others in the research data space. At the moment, they seem to be doing quite well without having any badges or certificates, and maybe they don't care. But maybe some of the other players would do. But I think, I mean, that's just one part of the problem you're trying to solve. And the bit about the microservices and whatever is another part of it, but it does all seem to fit together.
But okay, yes, Kevin, but it occurs to me, going back 20 minutes in the conversation, that maybe what you've done now is identify another potential target for the outputs of this working group, which is, I'm a provider of reliable disk. What is it that I need to do in order to offer my services to someone upstream, if you like? So you could imagine that these recommendations could be useful for potential service providers as well as potential service consumers, which is, I think, how we've been thinking about it up to now.
Yeah.
Any other hands raised in the room? Oh, down the back.
Hiya. I totally take all the points on metrics and tests and all the rest of it, which is really good. This whole process for Core Trust Seal didn't just come out of the goal of certification. Yeah, the certification piece was the cherry on top of the data seal approval process, which was a bunch of people working together to try and reach consensus. And if you read the stuff around Core Trust Seal, what they'll also do is, I mean, the references are all, there's a really good list of references in the case statement. A lot of this does really clearly say that this is about a community of practice as well. Yeah. So the stuff that's in Core Trust Seal that Core Trust Seal will look at, and the things which are binary, are binary because there's community consensus, and the things which are less binary is binary because we haven't reached community consensus, which is why I think this would be hugely valuable. Yeah. If you could work through a process where service providers, in the case of some software providers as well, yeah, if you concretely stamp all of your service outputs with one PID system, that would be valid evidence for Core Trust Seal. So there is room for service provider transparency here as well. But I kind of echo the point about the trust word, which is always a little bit slippery. A lot of this is about transparency across the organizations. So it would be amazing, not for me as a Core Trust Seal guy, but for me as a repository guy, if the outcome of this was just to be able to compare the functions and activities of these different service providers in some kind of meaningful way, and then drill down into transparent information, which may or may not be evidence. But I think that a lot of the value of this is about reaching consensus, because each of those revisions of Core Trust Seal really highlights the point that the Core Trust Seal is not there to stamp its authority on things, but to seek consensus from the community. And this has come out of, like we did the consultation that Court-Seal did, developed this set of issues around scope, designated communities, specialist versus generalist repositories, and technical repository service providers. These were these things have actually come out, and the Court-Seal has pushed this out as a way of saying these are areas for further community consensus. And I think one of the things to think is certification is a different thing on top. If you want to micro-certify microservices, then there's a mechanism, but there are multiple levels of benefit to the community as a whole as you step up through clarity, transparency, and then move on to kind of metrics and tests. All of these things make, I totally take Kevin's points that you need to really think about the audience for this, but I think there are multiple levels of the community that can benefit if this is a good staged approach. So I think it's a really good effort.
I'd like to respond.
Yeah, thanks, Rabe. So I think what we could potentially do in the 7 minutes or so that remains for us is maybe just to think a little bit about the value proposition for any working group that might come out of here. So in the case statement at the moment, we just go there. That value proposition is at the moment directly focused on saying that we must somehow get to a position where it's possible to certify technical service providers as it's defined in the case statement. So I don't think if there are ideas about whether this is applicable, whether we should change it, whether we should be more or less ambitious, I think that's more or less the minimum value proposition that we should be looking at, because it takes care of part of the problem within a sort of achievable scope for 18 months or so. But what we could potentially make part of the work plan is to record and identify these additional ideas and issues that we are not addressing in the scope of the working group's lifetime, but still need some attention to take forward in one way or another. So any comments on the value proposition as it stands? I think they're basically saying that the type of approach that Court-Seal has had to discipline-specific repositories need to be extended so that it can include technical service providers, which to some extent would include non-disciplinary repositories, of course, the likes of Figshare and others, SERVS data repository and the like, because I think that's where the biggest advantage to the community would also lie, is to bring those generic repositories under some form of umbrella of trust.
So just to respond to that, so what we have in the health data space is many repositories, but very little data deposited in some of these repositories, and then very little reuse of the data that are sitting in the repositories. So for me, Court-Seal and why it's so important, or certification in general, is to try to have a more centralized approach, so we can have higher investment and fewer repositories that are actually following repository best practice. So when I hear you talk about, and I could have misunderstood what you were saying, certification of something like Figshare, Zenodo, or anything, like we have these repositories, generalist repositories, where we see very large uptake. So they're obviously doing quite a good job. They have a lot of deposition of data. They have a lot of uptake of data. And then in the health space, you see there's a lot of money going to these repositories, but there's not a lot of deposition. There's not a lot of uptake. And so I think if we could be a little more targeted in terms of where do we really need this certification? And then what is the certification getting us? So are we actually driving people to these repositories? So in the health data space, I mentioned Import. It was the only certified repository that I could find in the COVID-19 space, we don't really need to drive a lot of people to import. You know, they're doing quite well on their own. They have a big footprint, but we do need to winnow down, you know, the 400 other repositories and say, look, you know, of these 400, these 10 really deserve sustained investment. And so I think like being a little more targeted in terms of where's the need, where's the benefit, and thinking more about that value proposition would be useful so that we can get some movement from the recommendations.
Maybe just some quick thoughts on that. I think it's true that one wants to channel deposits of research outputs to the repositories that are most suited for them. But it's somehow a slightly different question for me, because this involves saying that if there is some discipline-specific certified repository that can be the target of your deposit, or a national one, or a format-specific one, such as a gene bank or whatever the case may be, that will always be a better choice than some very generalist repositories such as Figshare or Zenodo. But one can't exclude the possibility that Figshare and Zenodo can comply with a subset of the community's expectations in terms of trust. So we need to balance the two. And it's, for me, slightly separate questions, I think.
Are there any more questions in the room? We are in the last 4 or 5 minutes of the session. We have 1 or 2 small things to just wrap up the session. But does anyone have any sort of final comments that they'd like to make? Mark here at the front side.
I think there's a slight difference, and I'm not sure if we are looking precisely at what, because the core trust seal is about certification of a service. This is mentioned to be service provider. So are you certifying the provider, the organization? So that is independent of the service. Are we also extending this to the service and to more generic type of services, or more focusing on provider? Because I think if you look at the comment made by Kevin, we provide, our organization provides many different repository services to many different customers, but we only can certify per repository. And it would be helpful that we can certify the organization to provide those services as a basis, and then do a next step for the individual services.
No, I think that's right. We need to take that nuance on board in the work that gets done in the working group, because you could have a service at an organization that satisfies a subset of the requirements of something like core trust seal, but embedded in that for 1 or 2 of the criteria, you might be using a service provider that is certified for long-term preservation, for instance. So there's that sort of, how shall I say, differentiation. The service to the end user might comprise of many components that are individually certified in principle, I would say.
Thanks, Lou. Anyone have any very, very brief last comments before we move on to the final slide and wrap up? I don't see any hands. Okay. Right, so thanks everybody. I know we're in the last minute or 2 of the session. Thanks. Obviously, there's a lot of opinions on what the group should be focusing on, what it shouldn't be focusing on, how we should go about the work. The next stage essentially is to ask people to commit some of their effort and attention to this. So as you mentioned earlier, Vim is currently the only co-chair of the group. To progress the group, we obviously are at the case statement and is very much in the draft stage. So we're asking people to contribute to that where they can, in whatever format they can, contributing content, just responding, reviewing the sections we have. But also vitally, we need some more co-chairs for the group. So on the screen here, and then there's the link in the collaborative notes for those on Zoom. There's just a very, very brief declaration of interest form, just your name, email address, and just a couple of lines on why you might be interested in becoming a co-chair of the group. So for those of you who don't have much experience with RDA, who mightn't be aware of what the co-chairs do, essentially just leading the group, but one of the key points of the support in Tiger is that we will be working with the co-chair. So I'll be working with Simon, who is on joining us online today. So we'll be working with all the input that we've are just going to try to consolidate what we the discussion today and feed that into the case statement, and then hopefully the co-chairs will be able to sort of refine it and we'll get it ready for final submission to tab and opening up for the community review. So just kind of very basics of the next steps. We will be looking to hopefully finalize some new co-chairs in the coming weeks, if possible, months, if necessary. Some more admin type things we'll be adding to just putting together the mailing list for the group. So if at this stage we don't have the group set up on the RDA website, but if you are interested in joining the group, either as just a regular member or as a co-chair, please will ask you to go to the case statement, which I had on screen a second ago, and just add your name. There's a table towards the end of that document. Just add your name and contact address there. That would be massive help, and we'll add you to our mailing list. We will be working on the case statement, as I mentioned, and also we'll just be putting together a sort of regular-ish schedule for next meetings, which will be taking place obviously outside plenary time. So it'll be regular Zoom meetings, and we'll obviously be looking to, because of the nature of RDA groups, we'll be working with people across the globe. So we'll be looking at identifying the best times or not terrible times for people, depending on where they're situated. So I think we're at the top of the hour now. I'd just like to thank everybody, our three speakers this morning. So Mark van der Sanden, Andrew Chalauer, and Wim. I'd like to thank Ingrid for the work she's done on just getting this group started, and Simon at home as well, who's been taking notes for the session. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll go enjoy your lunch.